Tonight, cries of help for Gaza and the grief driving Israel. We look at why calls for a ceasefire are being ignored. As much of the world screams stop, Israel says it must fight on to avenge October the 7th and rescue hostages. We hear from one of those freed so far after seeing her husband and daughter killed.
It was one of our, saddest happy moments, this return to Israel.
But as Gazans starve, the UN says Israel may be committing a war crime. Aid bosses tell me it's time to relax rules at the border.
The grip of the famine threat is palpable.
This evening, we're live in Jerusalem to hear if international pressure will make Israel change course. Also tonight, the reformer now forced to resign. Ireland's Prime Minister quits after two damaging referendums that backfired.
I don't feel I'm the best person for that job anymore.
We'll look at Leo Varadkar's legacy and his final act in Washington, telling Israel to stop the bombs in Gaza. Plus, what's the secret to keeping your country happy? We'll look at what Finland gets right. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. For many, it's hard to comprehend just why are talks over a ceasefire in Gaza failing. Tonight, we're going to try to understand, and we start with one woman, a former hostage who spent 7 weeks in captivity alongside 3 of her children. She's called Shen Almog-Goldstein. Her story is harrowing. On October the 7th, she watched on as Hamas killed her 20-year-old daughter and her husband. They had no time to say goodbye before being torn away to Gaza for almost 40 days. It's thought more than 130 people are still living through that experience. A life spent between tunnels and blown-out buildings as war rages on all around. A war that's now reportedly cost the lives of more than 31,000 Gazans. For those who have survived, it is a life of starvation and fear. And the biggest fear of all right now is around Rafah, a city in the south where 1 million people have been displaced. Today, Israel's Prime Minister repeated his threat to move troops in. Benjamin Netanyahu says it's the only way to defeat Hamas and bring hostages like Shen back home. But even she's conflicted by the devastation she saw. Tonight, I speak with 2 international aid bosses trying to convince Israel to change course. One tells me it would be easy to feed the people of Gaza if they were allowed to. But first, the Israeli woman whose story, like so many others, is driving the country's army forwards. Here's our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle.
The final time that Shen Almog-Goldstein saw her daughter, she was dying on the floor of their home after being shot by a Hamas terrorist. Minutes earlier, her husband had also been killed. Shen and her surviving 3 children were forced to step over his body as they were led out of the safe room at gunpoint. There was no time to say goodbye.
He took this wooden plank and he stood there at the entrance to the safe room to protect his family, and then they broke into the safe room. I don't remember hearing gunshot, but there are shots on the door to the safe room. Maybe he managed to hit with this wooden plank, or I remember that I turned around and there were 4 or 5 of them inside the safe room yelling, and they shot Nadav in the chest, from very close range. In 2 or 3 places, he was lying like that with his arms up. He was quiet. I thought that maybe he was pretending.
They were bundled into their family car. CCTV from the Gaza border fence shows the car driving fast along a road and then turning off onto a dusty field.
Near the fence, they stopped and they started putting bodies into my trunk, the trunk of my car. And Agam said to the boys, "Don't look back, not to look back." Our abductors were overjoyed. They took a selfie picture. They took pictures of us in the back seat. I remember a Red Cross ambulance, and I was looking and kind of begging with this look that was asking for help, and he looked back at me with this helpless look.
For 7 minutes on the 7th of October, they were driven into Gaza. They would remain there for the next 51 days.
The first 2 days were in a tunnel, and in the last week we were in a tunnel, and in between we were in apartments. And the conditions in the apartments were not easy. The windows, they would try to open them a bit, but most of the day the windows, throughout the day, the windows were closed with these heavy curtains. So as far as air, ventilation, sunlight, we didn't have much of any of that. We had electricity only for like 90 minutes a day. There were entire days without electricity. And then when there's water, when there's running water, you need to decide who's going to shower. The kids showered. Sometimes they would shower. Sometimes it was a group of 4 or 5 men. Throughout these 7 weeks, I only showered once. I wanted the children to shower.
Shen, Agam, Gal and Tal were regularly moved by their Hamas guards from apartments above ground to tunnels below. The fighting was often close by, the sound of airstrikes frightening. There were times she was worried they might be killed by Israeli forces, not their captors.
It was really scary and dangerous. We were really in danger. When they took us out to the street and we walked down the street and we saw the devastation and destruction, it was really hard. These are terrible feelings. You're in the middle of a war. It's a battlefield. It's not that I was thinking, oh, good for us, we showed them. It was terrible. It was terrible to see the destruction, the devastation, the poverty, the children in the streets.
On the 26th of November, 2 days into a week-long ceasefire, Shen and her children were released.
We waited in this car for 5 hours. They said that they were waiting to receive a signal, a phone call from the Red Cross. Everybody around us, the masses were taking pictures of us. It was so humiliating and scary. We knew that Nadav and Yam were not waiting for us. It was one of our, saddest, happy moments, this return to Israel.
On Monday, fresh ceasefire talks resumed in Qatar. Hamas has softened its demands, but the Israeli government has still described them as unrealistic and delusional. Shen says a new truce is urgent to get the remaining hostages out, many of whom are badly injured.
We need to do everything possible in order to release the people who are still there as quickly as possible. We were there towards the end with the young women who were injured physically, some complex wounds, some of them with severed fingers, with holes in their hands. We were with someone from Kfar Aza, and she didn't even know whether her mother and brother are still alive. So with all that uncertainty, we need to do everything possible in order to release the people who are still there, to bring them back to their families, to bring them back to our country, and do everything possible so that they'll be released as soon as possible.
Alistair Bunker with that report, and that was Shen's raw and emotional story of loss and survival. Well, joining me here in the studio tonight, former National Security Advisor and former British Ambassador to France, Lord Ricketts, and Zainab Badawi, journalist and also President of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Thank you both for joining us here on the programme. I mean, Zainab, we're 6 months into this conflict, and this is a tragedy for all sides. I mean, 31,000 Palestinians dead, and the hostages. I mean, we heard their Shen's story.
I mean, honestly, Yalda, just listening to Shen, I mean, what remarkable composure for a woman who saw her husband and one of her children killed before her very eyes, and for her to speak in such an eloquent manner. It really is very, very powerful testimony. But she also, in talking about her grief and losing one of her children and her husband, she also talked about the fact that the destruction that she witnessed around her that's going on in Gaza was also, in her view, intolerable.
Yeah, I mean, Lord Ricketts, there was this talk of some kind of ceasefire, discussions around a ceasefire before Ramadan begins.
Yes.
Or at least the Israelis, Netanyahu was threatening a major offensive in Rafah, which he continues to do today. And yet they've had to go back to the drawing board when it comes to the ceasefire. There doesn't seem to be any resolution at this point.
No, and the horror of Shen's story is what is fueling Israeli policy at the moment, the terrible suffering of the hostages. We must never forget that, even alongside the awful destructions going on in Gaza. But the hard fact is that what brings hostage releases is pause in the fighting, is then humanitarian relief going into Gaza. The endless war being prosecuted in the hope of destroying Hamas, which I personally think is an impossible objective.
Why do you think it's an impossible objective?
Well, because Hamas is deeply rooted in the society of Gaza. It's not just a terrorist organisation, although it is. It's also had enormous operations on social welfare. It's a political and welfare organisation as well. And you can destroy some of the fighters, most of the fighters, but the idea of Hamas you can't destroy. And if you're going to pursue that, then there is no end to this operation in Gaza and no prospect of safety for the hostages.
I mean, US intelligence report actually this week has said defeating Hamas totally was just not a viable objective. No. So,
and I guess the Americans would know all too well what that is like when you go into a place, try and defeat the enemy. I mean, you look at Afghanistan, they replaced the Taliban with the Taliban.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're accusing Israel today. The Americans, the staunchest of allies, are saying to Israel, you don't have a plan, you don't have a strategy.
I mean, absolutely. You remember when Joe Biden visited Benjamin Netanyahu in October last year and gave him a hug and said, Israel has the right to defend itself. But he cautioned him against acting in rage because he said that wasn't a very productive course. But I think the Americans are in a difficult situation, though, Yalda, because on the one hand, they say, yes, act with restraint, act within humanitarian law and so on, but yet they still are delivering the military assistance. So, it's a difficult circle for them to square.
Yeah, just on that, because there is now pressure on the Americans to do more. The fact remains they can't seem to figure out what it is that they want to get out of this.
I have never known such a wide gulf between an US administration and an Israeli prime minister. It's just extraordinary that the Americans have spent 4 months trying to get aid into Gaza. Netanyahu has stonewalled them. They're now driven to building a pier to get ships in. I know that's going to take several weeks. Or airdropping, which is the most dangerous way of getting humanitarian aid in, is pretty ineffective. They have not persuaded Netanyahu to open up the borders. This is a man-made catastrophe happening in Gaza, and the Israelis could change that. But yes, it's right, the Americans are not using all their levers. I think the point at which they start to say we're going to restrict arms supplies is getting quite close. And in the UK, because David Cameron has been saying we're assessing the international human rights obligations on Israel, are they satisfying them? And one of the requirements in UK export licenses for arms is that the recipient country respects international humanitarian law. So you can see that in the UK and perhaps in the US, we could quite quickly get to the point where we're using that lever, not being used at the moment yet, but I'm just amazed that Netanyahu has caused such a breach with the Americans.
Indeed, and we're going to discuss that in a moment, and we're going to pick up on the point you made there about the humanitarian situation, because Israel's refusal to let more aid into Gaza has been condemned by the UN's human rights chief. Volker Turk has said the projected imminent famine in Gaza can and must be prevented. The extent of Israel's continued restrictions on the entry of aid into Gaza, together with the manner in which it continues to conduct hostilities, may amount to the use of starvation as a method of war, which is a war crime. Well, let's go straight to our Alex Rossi, who joins us from Jerusalem. And Alex, I mean, we've seen now the UN using much tougher language there, talking about starvation, saying it could amount to war crimes because it is being weaponized.
Yeah, good evening, Yalda, from Jerusalem. That certainly, we are seeing the strengthening of the language, but it doesn't seem to be having much effect on the Israeli position. Certainly, humanitarian organizations are saying that what we are witnessing, what we're looking at that's happening inside Gaza is a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. They are talking about imminent starvation, of something like more than half of Gaza's population, so more than 1 million people facing imminent starvation in the next few months or so. They also point out that although there are two corridors essentially into Gaza over land at the moment, the airdrops and the drops by the ports are just not going to cut it. What needs to happen is the number of trucks going over land. It needs to be increased enormously. But without Israel allowing them through the checkpoints, easing them up through the checkpoints, that's not going to happen. Now, the Israeli position is that they are allowing more aid into Gaza, but clearly those very, the pictures that we are seeing inside Gaza are extraordinarily desperate people. It's not happening anyway soon enough. Now, we've also heard from the Israeli Prime Minister that breach with America, that gulf between how the war should be prosecuted, appears to be widening. But he says, Benjamin Netanyahu, that they will continue into Rafah. This is, of course, the last bastion, really, where there are still Hamas fighters. But the problem is that's where the population in large of Gaza has fled to try and escape active combat zones. This is what he had to say.
While we're preparing to enter Rafah, which will take some time, we continue to operate with all our might. We continue to operate in Khan Yunis, in the central camps, eliminating and capturing senior Hamas officials, as we did now in Shifa, eliminating hundreds of terrorists.
But certainly the dynamic when it comes to the aid needs to be changing quite rapidly. Now, everybody, of course, is focused on the potential for a ceasefire, but the mood music coming out of Qatar today does not appear to be particularly good, with senior Hamas officials in Beirut saying that they have a very negative reaction to what's being presented by the Israelis. So that ceasefire still seems quite far away.
Yeah, indeed. Alex, thank you so much for all of your analysis, for bringing us up to date there. Well, as the world watches the situation deteriorate, the head of the UN's relief effort in the Strip told me it would be easy to flood Gaza with food if humanitarian aid were allowed in. There's also the issue of Philippe Lazzarini getting into Gaza himself. This week, Israel blocked his attempts to cross the border from Egypt. It comes after allegations that a number of UNRWA aid workers are, in fact, members of Hamas. Have a listen.
I was supposed to go to Gaza on Monday. I was in Cairo. I was on my way to meet the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And on my way, I have been informed by the Israeli authorities that I will not be allowed to enter into Gaza, despite the fact that the rest of my delegation was allowed to enter. In fact, it is the first time in the history of the agency that the Commissioner General is deliberately denied to enter and to meet its teams in Gaza.
You don't know anything about this information that was given to the press today by the Israeli embassy here in London, where they say more than 2,000 UNRWA staff, 17% of UNRWA, are Hamas operatives and members of Hamas.
No, I haven't heard this information. You are just sharing it with me right now. But there have been, from time to time, allegations shared with social media or in the media about hundreds, sometimes thousands or couple of thousands of staff possibly affiliated with political parties. But the agency or the United Nations has never, ever been officially approached. This concern has never, ever been, in fact, shared with the leadership of the agency by the Israeli authorities.
We've heard from some of Israel's staunchest allies, the United States, European nations, the UK, saying that more aid needs to enter Gaza. It's something that you've continued to reiterate as well. Are those negotiations ongoing? And if you could give us an update on the aid situation, because, of course, as we've been discussing, there is huge concern around starvation and famine.
I believe when we are confronted to a situation of a man-made famine, the response is an easy response, is political will, and the political will needs to be translated with the opening of all the land crossing into Gaza. It is easy to flood Gaza with food. It is easy to reverse, in fact, this trend. And I also believe that it is definitely a stain in our collective humanity that such a situation is artificially unfolding under our eyes. And this cannot happen on the 21st century.
Why do you think there isn't political will? You talk about political will, there needs to be the political will, and yet nothing is happening on the ground.
Now, the question of the political will needs to be asked to the government of Israel. We need also to ask to the Hamas, how is it that both have not yet succeeded to have a ceasefire? We also know that the ceasefire would lead to the release of the hostages, would lead to a significant scaling up of the assistance in the Gaza Strip. This should be our priority, but meanwhile, food should not be used as a weapon of war.
Do you think the United States needs to be tougher on Israel?
I do believe that anyone having influence on political decision should fully use their influence.
And that is the United States President Biden?
That's the United States or any other countries having an influence on the policy decision in Israel.
Are you worried about the situation in Rafah in particular, that an operation will take place there?
So far, this conflict has already been the conflict of all the possible superlative in terms of number of people killed, children killed in 4 months, more than the number of children killed in 4 years across the world in all the conflict situation. And now we are talking about a possible new offensive, which can only end with a new layer of disaster in the Gaza Strip.
Mr. Lazzarini, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That was Philippe Lazzarini, head of UNRWA, speaking to me there a little earlier. We still have our panellists here, Zainab Badawi and Lord Ricketts. We will be getting their views in a moment. But let's go to a break first. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Still to come, I sit down and ask a former Foreign Secretary what Israel needs to do in order for Gaza to avoid a famine. David Miliband, now Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee, shares his views on who bears responsibility for the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the Strip. Plus, Ireland's Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, announces he's standing down. We'll find out how the news has gone down there and in the States.
When I was 21 weeks pregnant, I found out that I was going into preterm labour. They did everything they could to try and stop that, but I still ended up having the twins at 25 weeks. Obviously, it's a very, very scary time when you have babies that premature. So I had Luna and Luca on the 31st of Jan in 2022, and obviously we're rushed to neonatal, and you just kind of try and prepare yourself for a very long stay in hospital.
You were in hospital a long time, weren't you?
Yes, 89 days in total Luna was in hospital for. And at the beginning, it was Luna that was very sick. She was the very sick baby. And we weren't really concerned about Luca because he was doing really well. But then very suddenly, when he was just 3 days old, he died of a condition called NEC. So then we had to kind of deal with the grief and the loss of losing a baby, which obviously is, you can't really put into words. No. And then still have to deal with another baby who's very sick and poorly in the neonatal. She moved to special care when she was about 7 weeks old, and that's when we kind of knew that she was kind of on the straight and narrow. The Tommy's New Research Centre basically set up because at the moment 53,000 babies are estimated to be born preterm in the UK, which is just, such a high number. And those children, lots of them can die or they can have lots of complications. And the research centre aims to really cut that number and have lots of researchers kind of working together to try and come up with ways to kind of stop preterm labour and also offer care which for everybody is consistent across all different hospitals.
Welcome back to The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Still with me here in the studio tonight, Lord Ricketts and Zainab Badawi. Now, we're exploring how the humanitarian situation in Gaza can ever improve without Israel or Hamas agreeing to a ceasefire. Today, I sat down with the former Foreign Secretary David Miliband, now Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee. I started by asking Mr. Miliband for his reaction to the UN's warning of imminent famine in the Gaza Strip. Have a listen.
When you say the UN says famine is imminent, this isn't some official in New York dreaming up a press release. The International Phase Classification System is an incredibly technocratic, technical, even conservative process for assessing 5 levels of food insecurity. And what's happened in Gaza over the last 5 months is that half the population are now at level 5, which is called catastrophic. And those lucky enough not to be at level 5 are either at level 4 or level 3, which is emergency or crisis. So essentially the whole population doesn't know where its next meal is coming from. And this is an unprecedented situation, to have the whole population in that situation. But it's also unprecedented the speed with which this crisis has gripped the Gaza Strip. We, my own organization, we have doctors at one of the hospitals, orthopedic surgeons, with our partners Medical Aid for Palestinians, who are a UK-based group. We have local partners elsewhere in the Gaza Strip trying to do health work, child protection work. And the grip of the famine threat is palpable whenever you have a conversation with anyone who is working there or is engaged there. It's horrifying, very experienced aid workers.
What would you say to Israeli officials then?
I would say release the stranglehold on the number of trucks going in. Streamline the process for vetting, because once the UN have vetted it, that it's food, you've got to be able to smooth the flow. The blockages that exist within the Gaza Strip, because it's not just getting over the border at Rafah or at Kerem Shalom, it's also a matter of opening other crossing points, because we need to make sure that the whole of the Gaza Strip receives food aid. Remember, in the north of Gaza, you've got a population that was considered beyond the conflict after the first couple of months. There's now a new resurgence in the Al-Shifa hospital of fighting. But there can't be a military justification for the restriction on food aid or the other restrictions that are preventing humanitarian aid from flowing.
When I've spoken to Israeli officials, they've pointed the finger of blame at Hamas. They've said that criminal elements are hoarding the aid coming in. They've also pointed the finger of blame at aid agencies and said they've been part of the problem as well. They've said the UN is not working efficiently enough to get the aid in. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm giving very precise, very practical examples of what the Israeli authorities can do. I also say very clearly that the consequences for the population of the fighting in the Gaza Strip is the responsibility of all parties to the conflict. Of course, that's right. When it comes to the question of aid flows, the Israeli authorities are in absolute charge. They're in a veto position for the flow of aid in and across the Gaza Strip.
And ultimately, Israel is the occupying force on the ground. Shouldn't they be managing the aid coming in, the distribution, to ensure that there isn't a stampede and we don't see over 100 people dead in some instances?
Well, certainly yes. I mean, it's incumbent on them to fulfill their responsibilities. One of the arguments that we've been making around this question of airdrops, because you can understand people saying, well, look, if you're desperate to get food, surely anything should be on the table. Of course, that's right. But what we also know from our experience around the world, we're an international humanitarian aid organization, we know that airdrops are risky, they're expensive, and that's not a distribution channel to drop something on a beach, because what happens when you've dropped it? What kind of scrum exists? What kind of distribution mechanism exists? So we think there are some very straightforward ways that could at least ease the humanitarian suffering, above all the threat of famine.
Do you find it extraordinary that the United States, Israel's staunchest ally, has had to resort to what you're talking about, the airdrops, the fact that this is the most ineffective way to get aid into the Gaza Strip, and rather than using the various other border crossings, they've had to resort to this, and now talking about building a pier?
Yes, you're right. I mean, the first, second, third best options are to use the crossings, expand the number of crossings, ease the bureaucracy for transmission within Gaza. So yes, it is an extraordinary commentary on the humanitarian situation that these fourth and fifth best options are having to be addressed, but that's the situation we're in.
David Miliband, really good to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was David Miliband. Well, with me here in the studio is Lord Ricketts and Zainab Badawi. And Zainab, I mean, we can hear there from Philippe Lazzarini. We're hearing there from David Miliband. Aid agencies around the world toughening their language. They're really concerned about the famine and the situation in Gaza.
Absolutely. Just rolling back to Philippe Lazzarini from UNRWA, I think it's useful to just remember why the Israelis do not like UNRWA. I mean, it celebrates 75 years. It was set up in 1949 to help 700,000 people who were displaced, 1948, 1949. And its mandate keeps on being renewed every single year. So there it is, 13,000, 14,000 people in Gaza. I mean, the biggest employer of anybody, second to the Hamas government as it was. And, of course, it perpetuates the kind of refugee and displaced, status of the Palestinians. So the Israelis have never really liked that. So, of course, they are saying, I mean, they've revised their figures. They said at first 10% of UNRWA, 13,000 people were probably members of Hamas. They said that 12 were actively engaged in the October the 7th massacres. And Philippe Lazzarini, sacked 9 of them. And I think a couple were already dead. So, there is a history of antagonism between UNRWA and the Israelis.
They gave a press briefing today saying over 2,000 people, 17% of UNRWA, they believe, are linked in some way.
They revised their figure upwards, obviously. But, I mean, as Lord Ricketts said, it is the second biggest employer of people in Gaza. So, inevitably, if Hamas is leading the government there, then they are going to have people who are going to be sympathisers or members of Hamas. But just because it's difficult to operate in some situations and to distribute aid doesn't mean that you can't. It's not going to be perfect. Of course, some food gets, commandeered by, officials, or some of it goes astray. And having said that, the Hamas police force have been completely destroyed, so there's not going to be any supervision, is there, once it gets inside? I mean, we saw the terrible situation February the 29th, when 100 people were killed as they were trying to, in the stampede to get to the aid. So, there is near anarchy in Gaza, so it makes distribution of aid even harder.
And ultimately, though, Israel is the occupying force on the ground, so it is their responsibility to ensure that people don't starve. And there is a higher expectation from the international community on Israel, more so than Hamas, to try and do the right thing here. Israel continues to say, it's not us, it's the UN and they're being ineffective. It's not us, it's Hamas and hoarding or criminal elements hoarding the food.
Israel is one of the most advanced democracies in the world, and yet a few yards across the fence there is now starvation in Gaza. And Israel has complete military control of what comes in and goes out of Gaza. So it is up to Israel to facilitate the flow of aid in. It's no good blaming aid agencies or blaming Hamas. It's Israel's responsibility. And of course, there are members of UNRWA who are members of Hamas. We know that Hamas has been a social welfare organisation, a political movement. It's a very different thing to be terrorists. Of course, there shouldn't be any terrorists working for UNRWA, but it is the most effective, probably the only aid distribution organisation available. And what are our priorities? The priorities have got to be to help the starving people of Gaza. So I think the UK government and others ought now to be working again with UNRWA because that is the overriding priority. And only Israel can facilitate the scale of land movement into Gaza that can make a dent on this starvation crisis.
I mean, that's the thing, actually, when you say the UK, because UNRWA saw, a lot of its money suspended because of the investigation which is ongoing into just, whether there was any involvement by some of its members on October the 7th. And it gets, 45% of its money from EU countries and about 30% from the US?
Yes.
So you can see the suspension will really hinder it and hamper it. Yes, that's a big factor.
Yep. We'll keep you both here, Lord Ricketts and Zainab. We're going to go to another break. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, the resignation which took everyone by surprise. Or did it? Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar announces he's stepping down, but were the signs there all along? Welcome back to the programme. In a moment, we'll hear the thoughts of our panel, the former British ambassador to France, Lord Ricketts, and Zainab Badawi, president of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Now, he was seen as the Republic of Ireland's great reformer, winning plaudits for his leading role in the 2018 referendum that legalised abortion. But today, Leo Varadkar resigned after 2 damaging defeats in referendums, trying to modernise the country even further. So how will people look back on his legacy? A warning, this report from our Ireland correspondent Stephen Murphy contains some flash photography.
A mystery press conference hastily called. The podium awaited a potential bombshell. Leo Varadkar strode out and didn't disappoint.
I knew that one part of leadership is knowing when the time has come to pass on the baton to somebody else, and then having the courage to do it. That time is now. So I am resigning as President and Leader of Fine Gael effective today, and will resign as Taoiseach as soon as my successor is able to take up that office.
His voice cracked as he tried to outline his reasons, political and personal.
There are loyal colleagues and good friends contesting local European elections, and I want to give them the best chance possible. And I think they have a better chance under a new leader. Politicians are human beings, and we have our limitations. We give it everything until we can't anymore, and then we have to move on.
Leo Varadkar was Ireland's first mixed-race Taoiseach, first gay Taoiseach and youngest Taoiseach when he became leader in 2017, aged 38. He was seen as emblematic of a modern Ireland, especially after overseeing a referendum to legalise abortion. He battled to avoid a post-Brexit hard border, striking a landmark deal with Boris Johnson. But his prickly nature often irked Brexiteers and Northern Irish unionists.
Do you think you're guilty sometimes of saying things, for example, like Britain needs to come to terms with the fact that it is now a small country? Do you not see that that's provocative or even condescending to people who voted for Brexit?
I think sometimes you have to tell it as it is.
Recently, he was under pressure, with backbenchers lining up to quit and a crushing defeat in twin referendums. Maybe the writing was on the wall if anyone had looked closer. Leo Varadkar may be stepping down as Taoiseach, but that doesn't mean a general election. A new Fine Gael leader will be elected in the coming weeks, and they will take the Taoiseach's office here with the full agreement of Fine Gael's coalition partners. They only found out the news last night and seemed as shocked as anyone.
I was surprised, very surprised, didn't expect it at all. It's not something I had anticipated, but I do wish Leo the very best. It's not an easy decision for him to take. A lot of courage in that decision.
But not enough courage to call an election, according to the leader of the opposition.
Why he took the decision today, I can't answer that question for you. And now that Leo Varadkar has made this decision, has resigned, logically and democratically, we should move in one direction only, and that is to the calling of a general election.
A politician renowned for doing things his own way has departed on his own terms, but this exit has left more questions than answers. Stephen Murphy, Sky News, Dublin.
Well, let's get the perspective from Washington and speak with our James Matthews, who joins us live now. And James, you know, one of the last things that Leo Varadkar has done in the last week, he was standing next to President Biden in Washington, and he really talked about the importance of supporting some kind of ceasefire, getting the aid into Gaza. It was a very sort of delicate diplomatic path that he was walking.
Hi, Yalda. Yeah, it was always going to be a politically awkward trip for Leo Varadkar, given that many had criticised him for coming here in the first place. His stated view was that his voice, the voice of one of the more outspoken critics on Gaza and critics of a lack of action, as he saw it on Gaza, he said that his voice would be heard more clearly should he make the trip for St. Patrick's Day. With Joe Biden on St. Patrick's Day in the company of the US president, he wasn't overtly critical. He did tread a diplomatic path, didn't dig him out on the differences between the two men, but rather emphasised the areas on which they converge. Thanked President Biden for his efforts to secure humanitarian ceasefire, for example, without any hard analysis of what that ceasefire would involve, how long it would last, and the long-term plan around that. So, you know, this was an individual who was here for principally a purpose of strengthening ties between Ireland and the United States. He invoked, in the context of Gaza, he invoked the Irish experience, said that the Irish saw history through the eyes of Palestinians. He also said the same about seeing history through the eyes of Israelis to some regard. So in the presence of a proud Irish American president, he wasn't overtly critical. But I think invoking the Irish experience carried a strength in itself. He grabbed President Biden by the heart so that he didn't have to grab him by the throat. Let's have a listen to what he said.
When I travel the world, leaders often ask me why the Irish have such empathy for the Palestinian people. And the answer is simple. We see our history in their eyes, a story of displacement, of dispossession, and national identity questioned and denied, forced emigration, discrimination, and now hunger.
Leo Varadkar there talking about the situation in Gaza as he stood next to Joe Biden. Let's bring our panellists back in. He was seen as well, he is seen as a reformer, but it hasn't gone well for him.
Not in the last few months, no. Of course, nobody knows exactly why he's decided to go now. He has been leader of the party for 8 years. He did lose those 2 referendums. There is an election on the horizon by this time next year, and clearly he felt that if he was out, then maybe Fine Gael could do better in the election. I think it probably brings forward the point where there will be an election in Ireland. If that produces a Sinn Féin-led government, as the polls suggest it might, we're then in the very interesting position of having Sinn Féin both south and north of the border leading the government. Does that open a new chapter in Irish relations within the island of Ireland as well as with the UK?
And both sides of Northern Ireland and Ireland led by 2 women. I mean,
Indeed.
That would be... Yes, sorry, Yalda.
No, that's all right.
I should have said.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it would be interesting.
But
yes.
Let's talk a little bit about how he will be remembered, because he had one sort of reputation domestically, but another one internationally.
Yes, that's why I've always thought, I mean, you know, talking to people, you know, very struck by the fact that his father was born in Mumbai in India and, you know, son, obviously, of an Irish woman and gay. He came out as gay in 2015. And so he seemed, you know, people saying, gosh, Ireland's changed. They've got this non-white gay prime minister. So socially, he was very liberal. And that's, you know, that was the kind of image he had internationally. But domestically, he was quite conservative. I mean, economically and politically, he was really centre-right, obviously, Fine Gael leader. And so I think that's interesting. But what I do like about him is the fact that he always said, I'm going to quit politics by the time I'm 50. So he's like 5 years ahead of schedule. But it's a good lesson for all those leaders out there. I mean, we're talking about the Palestinians, Mahmoud Abbas, 88 years of age. I mean, you know, so, I mean, you know, the gerontocracy should listen. But it reminds me also of Jacinda Ardern. Do you remember in New Zealand?
That's right, when she
also quit and it was, took everybody by surprise.
Zainab, Lord Ricketts, thank you both for joining us here this evening. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. After the break, how happy is your country? The global report on, well, everyone's mood has dropped. America out of the top 20 list for the first time. I'll ask the country's top doctor what's going on.
we've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. Finland is officially the world's happiest country, top of the charts for the 7th year in a row in the World Happiness Report. America, on the other hand, has seen happier days. For some, the problem lies with social media and its impact on young people. Today, I sat down with the country's top doctor, America's Surgeon General Vivek Murthy.
I think what we've seen is a growing mental health crisis in the United States and also in other parts of the world. And my deep concern has been in particular about young people. We are seeing a literal youth mental health crisis in America. It's the reason 2 years ago I released a Surgeon General's advisory on youth mental health. And this is of deep concern to me. We're seeing rising rates of depression and anxiety among young people. And part of this is being fueled by loneliness and isolation, which have reached epidemic proportions in our country, in the UK, and in other nations as well. And now we're learning more and more that loneliness and isolation, which, by the way, was exacerbated by COVID, has a profound effect on our mental health and well-being, increasing our risk for depression and anxiety, but also increasing our risk for physical illness as well, like heart disease, dementia, and premature death.
Access to social media, to phones, to digital devices, people are getting younger and younger and younger. They're giving very small children phones and laptops and iPads now.
Social media is extraordinarily complex. It's evolving rapidly, and many parents, despite their best of intentions and efforts to monitor their kids' use and ensure that it's safe, they're finding it extremely difficult to do so. And so we've got to step in and have the backs of parents. And we've done this before with other products. We can do it again with social media, but we have to act now because social media has been on the scene for 20 years. And we have failed to put in place and fundamentally implement the kind of safety measures that have long been needed. We can't afford to wait any longer.
What worries you most? What keeps you up at night?
I'm just deeply worried about the direction of young people's mental health right now. You know, in the United States, we have nearly 50% of high school age students who say they feel persistently sad or hopeless. We have a third of high school girls in America who have actively considered taking their own life. These are staggering, disturbing statistics. The youth mental health crisis is the defining public health crisis of our time, and it's why I will do everything I can, certainly, to help address it.
But are you hopeful and optimistic about the future as well? As well as, things like AI, for example, which is also very concerning for so many.
Well, I'm extremely hopeful, actually, about the future when it comes to mental health. And one of the biggest reasons I'm hopeful is actually because of the conversations I've had with young people. See, many young people are not just sitting back and allowing this crisis to wash over them. They're recognizing what's happening. They have deep insight into what's driving the crisis when it comes to mental health, including social media, including the loneliness challenges. And they're actually stepping up to fashion solutions.
Dr. Morsi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Yalda.
The US Surgeon General there talking about happiness, social media. Zainab and Lord Ricketts are here with me. And Zainab, I mean, this report is supposed to talk about happiness, but it also talks about all the unhappy places.
Yeah, absolutely. And just picking up on what he said, I think one thing I find very concerning is about young men, actually, when you see the number of young men who feel that perhaps in a world of gender equality, that perhaps they don't quite understand what masculinity means. And you see so many of them voting for centre-right parties, as we saw in Poland. I think half of men under the age of 21 voted for far-right nationalist parties. So it's all very worrying about mental health. But happiness, Finland top, but it's a small country, so it's easier to get things right, isn't it?
Well, Rick, it's 20 seconds.
Young people have such a tough time. On one side of their iPhone, they've got perfect pictures of the perfect night out, the perfect holiday. On the other side, scenes of horror, destruction, anger, division.
Yeah,
it's tough.
It's tough. Lord Ricketts, Zainab, thank you both for joining us here on the programme. That's it. The news at 10 is next. Good night. Great, thank you. Thank you.